complicated, you know, man. Like a dang Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Stephen Carson, Radical Liberation. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show.
Thank you. Nice video intro. You said that was the first time using it, right?
Yeah, I would.
Very cool.
I would be very embarrassed to admit how long it took me to make that. After Effects is by no means an intuitive program.
I was impressed.
Look, with enough YouTube tutorials, you can make almost anything, right?
Right.
But anyway, before we launch into things, because I'm excited for our conversation, if by some miracle someone in my audience hasn't heard of you, could you provide some sort of introduction to yourself?
Oh wow. Okay. Well, I guess. I mean, you basically talk to people about politics and stuff, right? So, I guess the relevant things to mention very briefly are that this is my second time doing stuff, being active. The first time was back when I was single and when I was first married and first having children, and then we had so many children, I just withdrew completely because I was just too busy. We were having baby. And in that first round, I was most strongly associated with the Mises Institute. Still am, I think, to some degree. But the Mises Institute, LouRockwell.com. I have articles on Mises.org, articles on LouRockwell.com. I predicted 9/11 privately. That wasn't a public thing. That interests people sometimes to know. And then, like I said, I got busy. And then several years ago, I decided I wanted to re-engage in my hobby of political economy, and had the good fortune to send a message to Academic Agent and have him say, after we went back and forth briefly, he said, "Hey, why don't you come on my show?" And that allowed me to be introduced to people so that when I started my channel, I wasn't, having 5 people watching. I was having, I don't know what it was, but, I immediately had an audience, right? Which is really handy, as you know, right? And so since then, I have primarily been doing a weekly show called Radical Liberation, and the subhead is Economics, Politics, History. And then something we've added basically this year, that's a weekly show. What we've added now is a roughly monthly show with my wife called the Mrs. RadLib series, where we cover some rather different topics, things like homeschooling, courtship, sex, I don't know what to call it. A lot of stuff to do with like relationships, family life, things like that.
I can say my fiance is incredibly long suffering with my bizarre, political interests, right?
Mm-hmm.
But she does absolutely love your streams with your wife. So I can say, at least from the outside perspective, someone who has no real connection to this other than, being engaged to me, she really enjoys it. So that's my seal of approval, right?
All right. Thank you for the feedback. I was hoping that, that really the Mrs. RadLib series has some of the same audience, right? But probably there's people who only come to my channel for Mrs. RadLib, and that's okay.
So obviously you have a background in economics, and my own degree is in finance, which is, kissing cousins essentially. But one of the things that I want to start just kind of at the 10,000 square foot level is what do you define as kind of the ideal role of economics? Like why is it important, and like what should it be applied towards?
Well, first of all, let me just give the very personal perspective, which is that my big driver, and maybe this is slowly changing into being sort of more activist oriented, but my big driver all along for decades, because I really got interested in what you might call political topics 40 years ago when I was a boy. My big driver was just to understand the world. I just wanted to understand the way the world works, as Academic Agent talks about, just realism, what is real. And from that point of view, economics, it seems to me, is a really essential thing, especially if you're going to be interested in politics and so forth, because economics teaches you that a lot of the things that people say are just complete crap. You know, I don't know, that in the sphere of economics, it is quite common for politicians, lay people, even economists, to say things that are the equivalent to saying that there is no law of gravity or something like that, right? Things that are just absolutely absurd and make no sense. But if you don't know economics, you don't realize that, and you just say stupid stuff. And do potentially, I mean, you know, if you have anything to do with like policy making or something, do stupid stuff that doesn't accomplish what you're hoping it will accomplish.
It's interesting you bring up the phrase "the rules of the game," because I remember very distinctly that kind of like moment where you have the form where it's like, okay, well, I've gotten into college, what am I going to study? And I remember thinking, well, okay, I'll study finance because those are the rules of the game. You know, and it's interesting because I've talked to people who are lawyers, who are those kind of, you know, connected professions, right? And a lot of them have said the similar things, which is like, look, like you may not like how the game is played, but at the very least you can kind of learn the parameters, you know, and kind of learn how to like move through the space at the very least.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's a number of things that are like this. I have a term for it. I like to call it the hard structures of reality, right? And so I would say that economics gives us some of those hard structures of reality, and then there's, you know, other areas that get more controversial, like sexual ethics and so on and so forth. I think these are things that are ignored at our peril, and I think we're finding all the perils right now in our society. We're hitting all the landmines, you know.
Well, right, and there's something to be said, right, which is it was somewhat more difficult to make that argument, like, oh, like it'll catch up with you one day, you know, because much like cigarettes, right, like they don't kill you all at once, you know, and like fair enough, maybe if you're 18 and you're smoking a pack a day, well, and look, I'll be the first one to admit this, cigarettes are delicious, but you know, 30 years later, when you're, you know, smoking out of your tracheotomy, it's much more difficult to or it's much easier to essentially make the argument that maybe the cigarettes, you know, to kind of extend this tortured analogy even further, weren't such a good idea.
Right. Yeah, I was just tweeting. This makes me think of this. Christopher Rufo. I don't even know who this guy is, but anyway, he was quoting from academic queer theorists, and they were explaining that these drag shows for kids are sites of queer pleasure. He's quoting from them, used to liberate children from the rhetoric of childhood innocence. And I commented on that phrase, the rhetoric of childhood innocence, really has been rolling around in my brain since I read this a couple weeks ago. And I said, this is it, the sharp spikes at the bottom of the slippery slope. The explicit destruction of innocence is what happens right before the fire and brimstone rains down, the water rises, the judgment comes, right? So essentially what you were just saying, right? We're at that point where instead of it being this speculative, like, you know, guys, I think we might be heading towards trouble, we're at the trouble stage, right?
Right. Yes, exactly. It's much less there's a rumbling noise in a distance, and much more half of the boat is already off of the waterfall, right?
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
So this is a question I didn't mean to ask you, but nevertheless, when I will. So in that, right, the idea of essentially liberating children, we get to that phrase liberation, right, which you've obviously tied yourself to. And to me, that phrase kind of conjures that idea from Carlyle, right? The divorce of all from all, essentially this kind of like atomization. And I'm assuming that you don't, you know, support that kind of like radical deracination. What does liberation mean in the context that you use it?
Right. So I guess one thing to understand is that I chose the name radical liberation before I was interested in economics or libertarian political theory or anything like that. So probably most people assume that I chose that as a libertarian, and that's not true. I actually chose it as a Christian, from a spiritual point of view. And so when I chose the term radical liberation, I was thinking more of passages from the scripture where Jesus says, if what did he say? I'm not going to quote it right, but he says, with me, you will be free indeed. and the whole thing about the Exodus and the Israelites being, well, they weren't Israelites yet, I guess, but the Hebrews being freed from bondage in Egypt. So there is an ancient biblical theme of freedom and liberation as something being good, and obviously tied intimately to a relationship with God, right? Obviously, that is probably not what Carlyle had in mind when he was going after the modern version of liberation. I'm guessing.
Right. So more of kind of a Pilgrim's Progress, right? Christian at the sepulcher, less Herbert Marcuse, if we can be a little bit direct.
Well, that's for sure. Yeah. I mean, I my father was a missionary to the Jews when I was growing up, and we were, I was a kid, right? But my family, my church, were ministering to like hippies, And so the impact of drugs, the impact of the sexual revolution was something where we were seeing it playing out and we were cleaning up the mess, we were dealing with the people who were wounded by that and finding Christ and wanting to turn their life around and all that. So for me, the theme of like the sexual revolution, for example, which Herbert Marcuse, I gather, was he wouldn't have just approved of it. He probably helped us have it. Right. He was probably one of the fathers of the sexual revolution. I grew up recognizing the sexual revolution as a damaging thing.
It's interesting that you bring that up because just completely coincidentally, one of my best friends, I was just in his wedding a few weeks ago. He's actually the child of essentially converted Jewish hippies. So his parents were, in kind of like the New York folk scene, right? Very much in kind of the center of the sexual revolution. And I don't know how, obviously, I think that they don't, I doubt that they would mind if I asked. I just haven't, right? Essentially, became Christian and are now, their son, for all intents and purposes, is no different from any of the rest of us, right? Like he's grown up in the same church. And so it's interesting. I didn't realize there was that kind of connection.
Yeah. So the guy who founded Jews for Jesus, have you ever heard of that?
I'm familiar with the organization just generally.
Yeah. So the fellow who founded Jews for Jesus, Moishe Rosen, trained my father. That was actually prior to him starting Jews for Jesus. So we were closely associated with the organization Jews for Jesus, and knew a lot of the people, including Moishe and many others, were friends of ours.
Oh, that's interesting. I guess it's a small world, right?
Yeah.
So to get back to Econ, can you draw some type of distinction between kind of, I guess if we can apply the is-ought distinction to Econ, because I think oftentimes economics as a field gets damaged by kind of the chattering class, right? Like, oh, here's a graph that says, give me a lot of money and I'll fix something. Do you see some kind of distinction between that as quote unquote economics and I guess like the more exacting social science?
Right. So as we know, all of the social sciences have had a huge political angle, and that's been playing out across them before our eyes, right? Well, and not just social sciences, right? Even, as the memes say, biology, right? And understanding of human sexuality and all of that has become super politically charged in our time, right? Or in your time as a younger person. The thing about economics is it's always been politically charged. Like some of this other stuff was more or less left alone until more recent times, right? And it was just it could just sort of be a science, at least to some degree. But economics has never been that way. It has always had an intersection with politics. And so it has always been a battle between economics as a science and quote economics, or economism, or I don't know what to call it, right? Something that's not so much a science as here's a thing I want to do because it gives me power, and I want somebody to give me a justification for it, right? And so I think a lot of the reason, at least what you're bringing up, the reason why that would leave a bad taste in people's mouth is because it's not economic science at all. It's just, it's like Paul Krugman, right? It's just using economic language to justify power grabs, partisan power grabs of one sort or another.
There's a mildly amusing article where someone essentially created a fake fund that essentially tracked the exact opposite of what Paul Krugman told you to do. And
Right.
it actually ended up doing quite well. It's just one of those like funny like business school things they tell you about, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting. And if you can forgive another tortured metaphor, right? It kind of reminds me of people's frustrations, I guess, like with Christianity more broadly and kind of like Protestant Christianity specifically, right? Where they essentially see these kind of like deranged actors essentially using something as a stick to beat their enemies with.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the sense of econ, right? It's the example of here's a graph that says I'm right, that I essentially cooked up over, 3 underpaid grad students, right? And obviously the example of Christianity is particularly easy to think of, the kind of like horrendous, like mainline Protestant denominations doing all kinds of awful things. And there's an understandable reaction of people basically saying, oh, well, I don't like that. I want that to go away. And that's, kind of like natural and human. But the problem is essentially this instinct to, well, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Well, if this eventually produced something bad, therefore we tear the whole thing out root and branch. And while it's necessarily like an understandable reaction, that doesn't mean it's a good reaction.
Right. Yeah, and I think we're running out of plausibility for that kind of approach, right? Because so much has been, so many institutions have been taken over by bad actors, all of them, right, including Christian denominations. So much has been taken over that if you're going to throw out all the babies with all those dirty bathwaters, you basically have nothing left at this point, right?
Well,
you don't have art, you don't have science, you don't have religion, you don't have, right? I mean, what's left to you if you're going to take that approach? If you're not going to take a sort of a reclaim it kind of approach, you're going to be left just like alone in a room with nothing, right? Because they've dominated all these things.
Right, exactly. You end up with essentially just like and I was actually thinking about this. I was talking to some members of my community on last Thursday about this, and essentially the conclusion was, well, if you could think of a semi-mainstream institution that hasn't been completely co-opted, and essentially the largest institution we could think of was actually the Mises Institution, and short of that, we actually couldn't think of anything larger. I mean, nothing against the guys at Mises, right? Like they have a great institution, but
yeah.
Not exactly massive, right?
Right.
The biggest thing you've got, maybe tearing everything else out is not the brightest idea.
Right. Yeah, it is a challenging time we're in because, like you say, there's not very many refuges, and it's very interesting for those who are like traditionalist oriented, right? Because what tradition is left that you can continue? Because I guess one way of being a traditionalist, sort of the obvious way, would be to just continue practicing some tradition, right? Maybe reviving it to some degree, but be putting yourself in continuity with some traditional practice that you think is a good traditional practice, right? Well, like with the sexual revolution, the traditions have been severed. So that, for example, my wife and I did a stream on courtship, and we're basically saying none of us know how to do this anymore. We can't look to what our parents or our grandparents did. None of us even remember another way to do things. The great comment from Charlemagne: I am for outlawing all organizations except the Mises Institute. Good thinking. Yeah, none of us can even remember how to be traditional, right? Even if with the best of intentions, we want to be, that doesn't mean we actually have the, tacit knowledge, right? How to do it. So this is a really challenging position we find ourselves in. Those of us who are like, okay, these new modern things that they're doing are terrible. We don't want that. We want something different. how about some of the older ways? What do you do then? Because we don't know how to do the older ways. They're gone. They've been gone for a generation or two or more.
Well, and I think and I think there's a lot of like unfair kind of like vitriol leveled at the baby boomer generation. But I think that there is a legitimate complaint essentially saying like, well, all right, like your parents taught you how to do things, and fair enough, maybe you didn't listen. Data shows that most of them listened eventually, just kind of begrudgingly. Mm-hmm. But kind of that kind of continuous chain was broken, and okay, not all, but enough that essentially we're in this position where we can't default to a tradition, and it's really why being a Christian now is a fundamentally different thing than being a Christian in, 12th century France, right? Like to a certain degree, there are areas like, look, I live in the Bible Belt. You can kind of default to a cultural Christianity, much less so than you used to. And it's not a particularly useful Christianity. It's a pretty diluted one. But if you really are interested in anything kind of traditional, like to some degree or another, you kind of are forced into the position of being a dissident. And so you kind of have to think of things and really wrestle with things that people before us never even had to consider, right? So courtship is a great example. You and I, hypothetically, right? Obviously you're married, so this is not really on the table anymore. That's something you and I have to consider as an option, right? Like there are other things we can do. We don't have to do that. So even landing on courtship, even thinking on courtship is not guaranteed. Whereas our great grandparents, maybe a few generations before that even, they don't even have to devote the mental bandwidth to it because it's the way that you operate.
It's just how it's done. Yeah.
And so in a way, I kind of sympathize with people who say like, oh, you're just LARPing, you're playing pretend. Because, well, yeah, we kind of are. But also, it's kind of like C.S. Lewis said, well, how do you do something that you're not doing? Well, you kind of have to play pretend. And so fair enough. He was talking about liking children and being a generally pleasant person. But like, okay, well, maybe if you want to have traditional sexual ethics, like that's not natural. So you're going to have to kind of play pretend at it for a little bit.
Right. Yeah. It's funny. As you were talking, I just thought about the fact that we talk about being a political dissident, and we talk about traditionalism almost in the same breath. And I never thought about just putting the two words together and saying, dissident traditionalism or a traditionalist dissident. It sounds like an oxymoron, right? It sounds like you're trying to square the circle. What does it mean to be a traditionalist and a dissident at the same time? Right?
Well, and I think that many of us are in kind of an odd position, right? Because there's this very convenient cultural narrative, right? That kind of, I guess, is linked to the idea of youth culture, right? And it's this cultural myth where essentially like every generation is a little bit more extreme, a little bit more left-wing than their parents were. And yeah, sure, they're crazy while they're in their teens and 20s, but they'll settle down a little bit. And where they settle down is a good bit to the left of their parents. That's just kind of the way of the world.
Right.
But I think a lot of people, and because looking at my chat, there's a lot of younger guys here, are sat in kind of the odd position of being significantly more conservative than their parents are. Yeah. Right. So my parents are Gen X. They're in their their mid 40s, and they're I love them, right? Like I respect them, but it is odd when your parents are kind of very much like kind of grown up Gen X slackers, right? Who have a good job and have a nice house, but very much are kind of into that kind of Kurt Cobain morality, and there's no real cultural narrative for being more conservative than your parents. You kind of have to feel it out.
Right. Yeah, because the traditional practices that you learn from your elders, you gain from the wisdom of those who came before you, right? And we find ourselves in the funny position of needing to flee from the wisdom of those who came immediately before us, right? Because it's terrible.
Well, and you're stuck in kind of an uncomfortable position of saying, well, I want to listen to my elders, but not those elders. Which I realize is a certain degree of not practicing what you preach. But I
find some better elders.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, back on economics real quick. I realize that since it's me talking, I get to be extremely personal about things. Not just give like textbook answers. So I just want to give my own personal perspective on economics. I'm not sure I've ever shared this even on my own show. Just what it's been like experientially to learn economics. And by economics, I mean Austrian economics, which might sound like it's a narrow sectarian kind of thing, but really Austrian economics is to a great degree just in continuity with centuries of economics that goes back to, say, the Spanish scholastics. Look up my article, my 2-part article on Mises.org about them. So Austrian economics is just a term we use for an economic tradition that is in the minority because everything's terrible right now, right? But it's not just a modern thing. It's actually a deeply rooted tradition in Christendom. Anyway, so as I learned Austrian economics and sort of started to see the world differently, I found myself responding as a Christian in a lot of the ways I remember seeing quotes from like the great scientists of the Middle Ages and even a little bit more recently than that, how learning how the universe worked, they found to be like a religious experience. It helped them to see God's design all around them, God's beneficent hand controlling the world, or setting in order the world around us, right? And so that's what I found with economics, because in a way, when you go from the is to the ought, in a way, the teachings of economics are just so dead simple. And of course, it isn't really that simple, as we know, because of culture and so forth. But in a way, it's really quite simple, which is just, if you wouldn't like kill and steal from each other, you'd be amazed at what'll happen. Human cooperation can be just incredibly powerful. It's just that we usually handicap it so that we don't get to see the benefits. But when we don't handicap it and we get to really see human cooperation go, wow, we can go to the moon. We can do things that mankind would have never dreamed of in the past.
Well, and I don't mean to, because there is the obvious kind of like heresy of the prosperity gospel, right? But there is something to be said for the fact that if you live a life in accordance with God, if you're a Christian, with Tao, with telos, whatever, with the rules, essentially of the universe, the rules of reality, generally things will go better for you. Obviously, that's not 100%. You can live a perfectly morally upright life and get an explosive brain tumor at age 30. I'm not saying that, but kind of controlling for those variables, right? Like your actions do have consequences.
Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean in kind of like the political sense. It also means on an interpersonal sense, you kind of build up, I guess, like this is kind of a, striking a blow against kind of like nihilism, right? Which is that essentially like the moral actions you take or fail to take not only matter for you in kind of a cosmological sense, which is obviously incredibly important, but also in like a real material sense. And maybe, I'm no economist, but maybe kind of like that kind of human cooperation is kind of an example of that, which is like your positive action, kind of interacting well with others directly benefits you as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't trash the world, when we're seeing a lot of people who are just happy to just treat everything, themselves, everyone around them, their neighborhood, etc., their community, just treat it like trash, and it's going to be a garbage, right? By the way, those practical benefits, the speech I gave at the Skildings event in England a couple weeks ago, maybe several weeks ago now, was actually about the early church. And one of the things I highlighted is that because the early church, they took care of each other, and the pagans weren't so good at that. We actually have evidence, going back and looking at like gravestones or whatever. We have evidence that Christians were actually living longer. So they, yes, some Christians got martyred and thrown to the lions and stuff, but overall, just like you said, Christians actually saw an actual practical benefit, not just a benefit in the hereafter for working with God's ways, right?
Well, right, because it's pretty easy to get kind of, and this is another kind of like a classic line you'll hear about, finance people talking about econ, right? It's like, oh, it's all theory, it's all it's all high in the clouds, which is fair enough. Something that can also be said kind of about like high moral theory, like, all right, like I get that this is right or wrong, but how does this impact my life? Not saying that's how you should think, but it's how many people do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting because it seems to me kind of there's more of kind of a syncretism there than there may initially appear. So I'm curious, right? One of the other things that I think people like incorrectly assume about econ is that it kind of necessitates a materialistic worldview of things.
Right.
How do you kind of counter that assertion?
Well, I was hinting at it already with what I just said, right? Which is that as I understood economics more deeply, I began to see it as having, I began to see it as a Christian, right? I began to see it sort of spiritually. Because I guess one way of having a materialist view, a reductionist materialist view, is that, you know, there is no higher meaning, there is no moral law. There's just get what you can while you can. Sort of, beastly behavior, right? And so it seems to me that what economics helps me see is that that is not actually how the world works. It can seem like it, kind of in the short term, right? But overall, beastly behavior leads to poverty, right? And in fact, following some basic, simple moral principles, sort of 10 Commandments type principles, can lead to prosperity. So that is taking a sort of reductionist materialist view of life, which is what people seem to think economics teaches you, would lead you, I would think, to potentially act in ways that don't fit with economics at all, not good economics.
That's an interesting point you raise. So if you can permit a slight digression, right? Like one of the other things that you're really, I guess, known for other than economics is having a large family.
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things you oftentimes hear when people talk about, having children is like, oh, it's too expensive. We can't make it work. The living conditions aren't, won't allow it. And look, I'm sympathetic to that, right? Like I want people to be in a situation where having children is an easy thing. But do you believe really that people's choice to have children or not to have children is primarily an economic decision? Or do you think that there's something else going on?
Yeah, I was thinking about this because you let me know you were going to ask me that. And, I think the thing to think about is, we have 8 children, and that is considered a bit unusual these days. But as you know, I think 100 years ago, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, that wasn't so weird, right? In fact, people would have more than 8 children. Were they richer back then? I mean, I don't think so. So it seems to me that the change from having more children to having less children does not correlate with poverty, at least in the United States, right? Standard of living has gone up, and therefore one assumes the ability to support more children, and the number of children people have had, the average number of people children have had has gone down. So there just doesn't seem to be a correlation there that people would assume. Now, that's being all historical and theoretical about it. I'll just say on a personal level, we've heard all the things that people say to large families, right, over the years, because we'll be out with, they're older now, but we'd be out with a bunch of young children all around us, and people would just react, right? Sometimes positively, sometimes not so positively. And one of the things they would say is, "Oh, I couldn't afford to have children. I can't afford to have a bunch of children." Which isn't crazy. I mean, it's good to be responsible, right? But it seems to me that thinking about children from that point of view is not the best way to think about it. In fact, a favorite children's book of mine is Peter and Wendy. That's the the not the Disney-fied Peter Pan, but the the original work by J.M. Barrie. That is a crazy book, by the way. You think you know something about Peter Pan, read Peter and Wendy by J.M. Barrie. It is satirical. It is cruel. It is funny. It is dark. It is not. The Amazon reviews are filled with parents complaining about it. Anyway, the reason I bring it up is that there's this great passage where Mr. Darling, Wendy, John, and Lucy's father, is calculating whether they can afford to keep the next child. Wendy's born, and then I forget the order, each one is born, and it describes how he is working the numbers and saying, well, okay, maybe if we scrimp on this and we don't do this year, okay, we'll keep this one, and it's hilarious. It's a great satirical picture of someone taking just a super bean counter view about having children, right? And I should just make a video where I just read that passage because I love it so much. And it just doesn't seem to me that is the right perspective to take about children. Now, I'll just tell you personally, for us, we did not have like a plan. We didn't have a number in mind. We did not intend to. We didn't like get married and say, okay, we're having, roll the 20-sided die, 8 children. We were actually a little bit older when we got married, and we were very happy to be able to have as many children as we had. But it was not a plan. It was just we felt called to be open to what God would send us in regards to children. I don't think the economic part of it, the financial challenge part of it is the part to concern yourself with. It has more to do with the moral and spiritual challenge of being a parent, which all parents face, even if they just have one child.
Well, I think it actually goes back to what we were saying about tradition, right? That before, tradition wasn't something you chose, it was something you were kind of born into, right? And there's something to be said just from a technological level, right? That before, having a family wasn't really an option. It was something that if you had a relationship, well, you had a family. And so right. Almost like the kind of our ability to be comfortable with that in kind of a social setting, or just kind of like all the institutions designed for large families have kind of gone the way of the dodo, as it is, as those kind of large families have as well. I even say it right because I mean, look, if you are a part of even a mildly conservative religious community, there are multiple large families in that community, right? But nonetheless, even in a church that has multiples of those, it's still difficult, because essentially everything is set up for a family of 2 to 4, right? And again, there's nothing wrong with having a family of 2 to 4, right? But you can't deny that the cultural inertia is kind of against you to a certain degree. And it is obviously, in your case, maybe it wasn't necessarily a choice, but it is, to a certain degree, and I don't mean to be indelicate here, but it's always something at any point you could have chosen to stop, right? Whereas again, our predecessors didn't have that option, and so to me, it's like, look, I enjoy Uncle Ted as much as the next guy. I'm not a full-on Luddite, but you do kind of see the argument that there is something about technology that it does kind of start to control us at a certain point, right? That like we've created this essentially like this incredibly powerful tool that's almost remaking society kind of out from under our feet, if you see what I mean.
Well, okay, I'm contrarian on the Uncle Ted stuff. I am not a techno optimist. That whole school of transhumanism and all that kind of stuff. But neither do I view technology as shaping us in quite the way that some people seem to. I think it's a tool, and I think it's, to a great degree, our values just end up getting expressed by it, So I would lay less emphasis on the pill than I would as a technology, than on, just to give us a nice segue here, anti-natalism and a shifting attitude towards the value of human life.
Well, you have done a much better job of keeping to the behind the scene notes than I have. So if you could you go into the kind of the the origin and history of anti-natalism? Obviously, I'm not asking you to go through the entire history of human thought, right? But maybe like a
Right.
notepad sketch, right?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we did a show on it, and I might share the link if I get a chance in the chat to pull it up. We did a stream talking about Malthus, and he's an economist in the, oh boy, I'm sorry, I don't remember, 18th or 19th century. And he does the simple thing of doing a projection. Okay. Like, here's the rate of population growth, and here's how much food we have, and looks like we are going to have more people than food, right? We've seen many projections like this over the years. I don't know if this is too much before your time, but do you remember the phrase peak oil?
That was, I'm familiar with it now, but it's not something that I grew up with.
Yeah, right. It was a big deal at some point a couple decades ago.
So yeah, I was born in 99, so that should give you some
99,
kind of context.
Right. So with peak oil, it's the same idea. Hey, look, we have calculated, we've looked at all the oil reserves, we've looked at the rate at which we're using oil, and we are about to hit peak oil. We're going to run out in X years. And it never happens. Okay. Nor do these other Malthusian predictions happen. Another one is, there was a book in 1968 called The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich. And he said, not just by the year we're in now, but by a couple decades ago, people would just be starving in the streets. There'd be so many people, and we wouldn't be able to feed them.
So this feels very much, and if you can permit me a little bit of a digression, I'm guessing you're familiar with the IQ bell curve meme, right? Where it's got a guy on the left side who's an obvious moron, a guy on the right side who's a genius. They're both saying the same thing in different words, and the guy in the center is saying something stupid, right?
Yeah.
And there's actually an interesting story about this, and I don't claim to be a genius by any means, but my grandfather's a classic boomer con, right? Like to the T. Loved Rush Limbaugh, loved Sean Hannity, loves war and America and Pierce Brosnan. And it's interesting because I'll never forget, we were out fishing when I was 5 or 6, and he was telling me about how his entire life there's always some new ecological catastrophe, right? Like, oh, the world's gonna freeze. Ice is going to form underneath the ocean somehow. I'm not quite sure about that. That might be me remembering it wrong. The whole ocean's going to freeze. We're all going to die. And then it was the population bomb. And now it's, if we don't send an autistic Swedish girl across the ocean in a sailboat, we're all also going to die from something I'm not quite sure about. But it's interesting you bring that up, because once you're aware of that, you do kind of rob that fairly powerful tool, of kind of its bite, so to speak.
Yep. Yeah. Lots of prophecies of doom that don't tend to come true. I just shared in the chat our stream on Malthusianism. We not only got into that, but we also got into some institutions that are still around, still influential. The Club of Rome. There was a group called Zero Population Growth, ZPG, that I remember. And there was eugenics, which was actually wildly popular throughout the Western world prior to World War II. I thought, and on this stream I explained, I thought that, like it got associated with Nazis and bad things, and then that was the end of eugenics. No. Huxley, not Aldous, but his brother Julian, was there at the United Nations in like 1946, 1947, giving a speech about eugenics. So at no point did eugenics really stop as a way of, as a mode of thinking by some people. That is, we need to socially engineer the human population. We need to control how the population grows. We need to manage the human stock, all that sort of social engineering kind of stuff. That's been a theme all through this. And I see it as very tied in with this Malthusian type of view. We can't, we have to control this, or we're gonna, doom is imminent, right?
It's interesting you bring up the, kind of like the long history of eugenics, because it's very, very tied in to kind of the progressive movement.
Yes.
And so being from Virginia, right, kind of at the heart of this, just kind of dotted all around the countryside are these, admittedly horrifying institutions, where the mentally infirm were sent to essentially be castrated. And it's interesting because I live fairly near Charlottesville, right, which is the site of, the big event that, has essentially apparently scarred our nation beyond any repair. But obviously coming out of that, the university there, University of Virginia, prestigious institution and extremely, extremely socially responsible. And one of the highlights of that was seeing, after a few years, all of the names on the buildings of the most progressive men of 1910 and 1915 and 1920, who were just so progressive and smart and academic, essentially being torn down by their intellectual offspring. And
Right.
look, I'm no iconoclast, but I'll admit that brought me a little bit of satisfaction. Like, I can't deny. I was smiling as I was walking around the city.
Right. Yeah. No. I mean, we probably should spend more time. By we, I mean just our sphere. We should spend more time beating on the progressives of about 100 years ago, because I think they really introduced a lot of terrible ideas. And not just ideas. I mean, they institutionalized those ideas, and we still have the institutions with us, and they're still screwing things up. The shift from charity to welfare, for example, was that big shift really happened about 100 years ago, and it's been an utter disaster.
So obviously, you've defined anti-natalism, right? Which is simply the idea that we should stop having children. Right. And obviously, to a certain degree, there is a mathematical backing, maybe not a super, in-depth one. But do you believe that that's inherently an empirical, a scientific, a mathematical belief, or do you think it's a spiritual one?
Oh, you mean the people pushing anti-natalism?
Or just the idea of anti-natalism itself, the idea that essentially human existence ought to be kind of limited in that way?
Well, I mean, to me, it seems quite obvious that it's a different metaphysical viewpoint, right? A sort of anti-human viewpoint. I mean, I assume you would have seen this sort of thing in movies as well, as I remember, which is just this whole theme of humanity is a cancer on the earth. Do you feel like you've run into that?
Yeah, exactly. The Fern Valley Avatar idea that, we were the virus all along, right? To quote the 2019 hashtag.
Right. Yeah, that whole thing. I just remember being hit with that. Maybe not when I was really young, but by the 90s, I'd say, and later, it was just ubiquitous. This idea that humanity is just something bad, And so you see these things where people, and we've experienced this. We've had people be negative to us about having children from that perspective. That we are overburdening the earth or something like that. And wow, who knew that humanism would lead to this anti-humanism, right? But here we are.
Well, right, and it's bizarre because there's kind of a baseline level of just kind of human corruption, right? I don't know what the Roman equivalent of robbing a liquor store was, but I'm pretty sure that people did it, whatever it was. There's just kind of the background radiation of kind of human problems. But to me, it seems and obviously there have been decadent cultures before, but it's a relatively rare one. The idea that essentially humans should kind of break themselves down as a species. That seems to me, and look, I'm not massively well educated, but I can't think of another example kind of ready to hand of that. Obviously, there's the Gnostic tradition, right? That kind of pattern of thought seems to reappear. And obviously in Christianity, but it is definitely a very an odd, self-destructive mental trap to a certain degree.
Well, I think we do see it. The Bible in the Old Testament talks about multiple times. It talks about civilizations that have gotten to a point where they are sacrificing their babies to gods. I remember reading it when I was young and being like, what does this mean? And then finally I looked it up when I was older. I was like, oh, okay. It would say that they pass their children through the fire. What that means is that they would burn their babies on an altar to their gods. That is, they were literally killing their next generation, So in a way, I don't see that as a million miles from, we don't do it with quite in that way, right? We use abortion and so forth, but
No, that's a
it's
fair
the same.
point.
It's the same. It's the same thing recurring again. Nothing is new under the sun.
No, you're right, and I think that there's also, it is kind of hidden by the fact that whatever you want to say this regime is, the managerial state, the empire of lies, whatever, they're quite comfortable doing almost anything as long as they don't have to see it, and so a lot of that kind of like, I guess, like baseline human nastiness is just kind of like papered over and hidden behind kind of convenient euphemisms.
Right.
I'm not.
We don't all gather around the giant bronze statue and watch as somebody puts their baby on the hands of the statue that have been heated up to a scalding heat. Right. This gruesome joint ritual where, the murder of innocence is celebrated. But we murder innocents, right? As I highlighted earlier, it happens. It just doesn't happen until very recently, right? Now we could argue where it's out front now. But I agree with you. For a long time, it was happening, but it was just sort of hidden away a bit. It wasn't something that was in everybody's face. Now it's starting to be in everybody's face.
Well, and I think that goes back to what we were saying earlier about kind of like just the economic problems, the social problems. It was very easy to delude yourself for a long time, but now it kind of seems that to one degree or another, the wheels are kind of coming off the cart, and it's much easier to kind of point that out and say, wait a minute, okay, it's like that. And I'm not sure if you've ever seen this, but there's a screenshot from the front page of Reddit in 2012. And it's a meme that says, what will happen if gay people are allowed to be married? And it just says, nothing. Gay people will be allowed to be married. And kind of like looking back on that with 10 years, you're like, oh, wow, my sweet summer child, you had no idea. And obviously there were a lot of people saying like, wait a minute, this isn't what you think it is. There's more than just what's the label on the box. But to a certain degree, like you kind of have to feel sympathy for people when you have essentially like every voice in the world, right? To a certain degree, your elders, every, voice of authority saying it'll be fine, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. And now I think a lot of people, and look, I'm kind of had the advantage of I wasn't really old enough to be saying anything particularly consequential 10 years ago, right?
Right.
But I do kind of feel a certain level of sympathy for people who essentially have kind of signed their name, to these things over and over and over again. And I can't help but imagine that at least some of them are kind of looking around and kind of saying like, oh, dear God, what have I done?
I wanted to share a quote with you. We did, my wife and I, she was involved with part 2 of it, but we did a 2-part stream with Nathan Hood and a couple other folks on the novel That Hideous Strength by C.S. Lewis. And so what you were saying brought this quote to mind from the book. Good is always getting better, and bad is always getting worse. The possibilities of even apparent neutrality are always diminishing. The whole thing is sorting itself out all the time, coming to a point, getting sharper and harder.
That's well said. I kind of just by sheer luck happened to read That Hideous Strength about 2 weeks before everyone in our circles did. So I feel like it was one of those odd situations where you put a book down, you're like, oh, that was a good book. I wish I had someone to talk about it with. And all of a sudden it's like the entire internet is reading that book. And so obviously I can't recommend it enough. It's great. Right. Yeah. I as much as I love Lewis's prose, I recognize the depth of his fiction. A lot of it isn't to my personal taste. It's just a matter of kind of like what I'm interested in. But that is quite good. I love it. It's obviously they're more intelligent men than I have talked a lot about it, especially in these circles. But if you haven't read it, you should. It's easy to read. It's shockingly prescient, and in kind of this odd dystopia where everyone's trying to figure, well, what mid 20th century novel are we living in? I think That Hideous Strength is probably the top of the heap, at least for me. Yeah.
And he's right. That quote I just shared in the whole book, this is like 60 years ago or something like that, maybe 70 years ago. And now I feel like that quote people would just shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, that's exactly what's happening right now. Right. It's mask off all around,
Well, it's very much this thing where, like we said, we've become kind of so radically decoupled from tradition They're kind of like the common sense and like the relatively normal things that, you know, our predecessors said. So Aristotle's a good example. Like a whole lot of Aristotle, if you were walking around quoting Aristotle in, you know, a 12th century monastery, a lot of people would be like, well, of course, you know, like, well, that's just what people do. You know, that's not particularly revolutionary. But now you read it back and you're like, oh wow, this is a revolutionary thought. I've never even considered this before. You know, essentially because we've been kind of removed from that chain.
Right.
And Lewis is a good example of that, even over a much less significant time slot.
I didn't want to forget to mention one more book on the anti-natalist Malthusian view of the world, and that's a book by a fellow named Julian Simon, and it's called The Ultimate Resource 2. In fact, I'm going to share a link with it. I think I've already got it ready to share here. Okay, The Ultimate Resource. And Simon, it's quite interesting. I just shared it in the live chat. What Julian Simon did is he was really caught up in this stuff. Like, it wasn't peak oil back then, but it was, you know, the peak oil of its day, you know, the doom and gloom thing of its day. And so he said his background had to do with statistics and stuff like that. So he thought, okay, I'm going to dig into the data and I'm going to show everybody, I'm going to find the evidence to demonstrate that this is true, you know, that we're headed towards real trouble. And he dug into it and got persuaded by the data that it was complete BS. And so he wrote this big, thick book called The Ultimate Resource. And it actually has a chapter on each of these things that people at various times tell us that we're in a crisis over. You know, oil, wood, you know, like lumber, what is it? The jungles in South America, right? The rainforests. Yeah, we're losing all the rainforests, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Each chapter covers one of these resources. And what he shows is that, of course, there's short-term fluctuations, but if you look at it from a bit of a long-term view, all of these resources, metals, energy resources, lumber, et cetera, they all are trending towards being cheaper. There's only one resource that isn't getting cheaper over time: people. People time, you know, labor costs, to put it bluntly, are the one thing that trends upward over time, while everything else trends downward. And so what he means by calling it the ultimate resource is that he says humans are the ultimate resource. Our ability to come up with alternative uses for things, to economize, to invent, to be clever, that allows us to not hit the Malthusian problem that keeps getting predicted. That's why we keep not ever hitting that problem.
Well,
anyway,
that's
it's a really cool and encouraging book.
Yeah, it is, and I'll have to check it out. I'm always in the mood for more reading material, even when I'm. I think, like all of us, I have a massive pile of shame. But yeah. I think we're kind of approaching on time. Do you have anything you want to get out of the way before we wrap things up?
Oh, I guess not. Are you talking about shills or topic?
Oh, I was going to say wrapping up the topic, and then normally I do shills after that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Any topic stuff. I don't know. I guess just since you brought up children and anti-natalism and so forth, I would just say that I would recommend having children as a general thing. I mean, you know, your situation may be particular, but in general, it is given by God to all of us to be able to have children. And it's a gift, and we should embrace it, I think. It is part of, you know, that Aristotelian becoming of the potentialities, right? Realizing the potentialities in us for a man to become a father and a woman to become a mother. And so I think I'd encourage people to embrace it as they can. Obviously, it's family formation. We're really struggling with that right now. But nevertheless, I'd encourage it and just say that, you know, it's a super challenging experience, but things that are valuable are challenging, but it's super rewarding. I mean, my wife talks about how, people say, wow, it must be so hard to have 8 children. And she said, well, actually the hardest part was going from 0 children to 1 child. Because at that point, she had, I'm just kind of quoting her, paraphrasing her. She said, at that point, I realized, oh, all I've ever done my whole life is think about what I wanted to do today for myself, and now I have to think about the needs of this helpless child, And so it's this huge shift, and a very challenging shift, that really pushed her and caused her to grow. So, embrace, getting a little Jordan Peterson here, but embrace having children as one of those challenges that is good for you and is a blessing, because I think children are a blessing.
Well, that's a great note to end on, Stephen. Do you have any plugs you want to get out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, I said it earlier, but I'll just say real quick that what I do on my channel, I guess, sort of has 3 aspects to it. One we already talked about, the Mrs. RadLib series, which is about every month. And that's in a playlist of its own. If you just want that, for some people, that's what you're going to enjoy on my channel. But then I have a weekly show, but it's really 2 things. It's every week, but it alternates. So on one week, this week, it just so happens, I usually have been having Black Horse lately, who brings some great knowledge of financial markets. And we talk about kind of current events with an economics or financial markets kind of angle. We've been talking about the concerns about Europe's energy situation, for example, things like that. Then on the alternate weeks, I do a deep dive, often with Ryan Turnipseed, who's been on this channel, as my co-host, and we do a deep dive on economic theory, political theory, history. Right now, I think this audience would find it particularly interesting, the series we're doing, which is a series on left-wing terror. So our show last week, it was just me that time, but the show last week was called The Great Martyrdom, and it was about, as far as I know, the greatest slaughter of Christians in the history of the world that happened just 100 years ago in the Soviet Union, in about those first 20 years of the Bolshevik regime, where many priests, monks, nuns, and of course just regular Christians were tortured, killed, and so forth. But that's just one example of this whole series we're doing on left-wing terror. A lot of tales that have been buried by our, I mean, I don't know if we should call the managerial regime left-wing precisely, but it seems to often spin things in favor. They kind of hide the sins of the left wing and magnify the sins of the right wing, it seems to me.
All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much for coming out. As far as shilling on my end, I will be on Unpopular Opinions on Academic Agent's channel tomorrow night. Immediately after that, I've got a special bonus episode with Thomas coming out about law, crime, and punishment, which I think will be a great episode. And then other than that, my links and RadLib's links will be in the description. This podcast now is also appearing on Spotify and Apple. So if you could head over there and listen to it, I'd really appreciate it. Even a simple review helps me out a lot. And remember, guys, keep your head up. The light can't last forever.